This power had no greater desire than to treat separately with our allies, and leave us wholly out of the question. Our only course to compel her to listen to our proposals was to adhere to those allies, and even to oppress such as she was most interested in our dealing leniently with. In furtherance, therefore, of the policy to which Holland was compelled to submit, the Emperor had only two courses to adopt, under the circumstances in which he had been placed by the most recent occurrence. The first was to take possession of Holland as a conquered country. The next to unite it for good to the French Empire. It remains to be considered which of these was the least injurious to Holland and the most conducive to the interests of France. In order to occupy Holland as a conquered country, it would have been necessary to send an army into it and withdraw the native troops. This could only be effected by removing thither a portion of the troops engaged in Spain, which would have been a measure attended with serious inconveniences, as we could not spare a single regiment from Spain. A forced occupation of Holland would have, moreover, to be estimated with reference to its external defense, its many fortified towns, the maintenance of public order, and the submission of the people, spread over a surface of country intersected by canals in every direction. The large towns alone would have required an army to overawe them in case of a favorable opportunity offering for a popular commotion. In the absence of such precautions, the danger would be incurred of an English army landing in Holland, where it would be supported by the general insurrection of the country, which would have afforded such efficient assistance as to protect that army from the consequences of an attack by interposing a multitude of obstacles in our way. Whilst occupying Holland as a conquered country, it would have been requisite not to disturb its public functionaries or its laws and usages, and yet to spread officers of the customs over the country whose very name would have been sufficient to excite a commotion. To add to all these inconveniences, Holland would have been necessarily subjected to a military government, against the arbitrary acts of which it could have no appeal. Thus situating it, would have suffered all the disadvantages attendant upon its annexation to France without any of the benefits which might otherwise spring from it, such as being independent of the will of a general officer, having her representatives in the Senate, the legislative body, the Council of State, and the Court of Cassation not being more burdened than any other French province. Mixing up her national debt with that of France, which would guarantee the financial engagements of the Dutch government, and getting rid of the line of officers of the customs on its inland frontier. The government of Holland had long ceased to have any other external existence, and such as its former reputation had secured for it. All the sources of its public prosperity had been successfully dried up. The very machinery of government had become a burden to it, and as the Dutch could not be entirely free, a great number of them preferred being united to France rather than exposed to the incessant vexations which are inseparable from a perpetual change of government. It would unquestionably have been desirable to avoid such an extremity, but the recent occurrence was wholly independent of the Emperor's will. If he had secretly entertained the project of annexing Holland to France, he had formerly been placed in circumstances more advantageous for doing so than those under which his brother's abdication compelled him to that course. The Emperor would naturally have been better pleased had his brother resolved to bear the weight of the government. But he felt unable to overcome his determination. It behooved him, therefore, to prevent the fatal effects it might have for France itself previously to his taking the interests of the Dutch into consideration. Other motives also made him decide upon the definitive annexation of Holland. Less, however, with the view of augmenting his own power than because he was at a loss what other course to adopt. The legislative body was not assembled when he decreed the annexation. It was out of his power, therefore, to consult it. This occupation of Holland created a great outcry in Europe, as it made a country disappeared from its rank as a power, in the existence of which almost every European nation felt a lively interest. They all kept up an intercourse with it. It served as a bank for every other country. They all accordingly felt alarmed at the fate imposed upon Holland, and began an interchange of sentiments concerning that act of policy which was displeasing to all. No attention was was paid to the motives that influenced the emperor. The motives of resistance to him found much readier acceptance, and if from that moment no regular communication was open between them, they were at least unanimous on the subject. That act became the signal of a fresh crusade against the emperor, and it was soon discovered that the several princes disposed to coalesce only sought a leader to wield the scepter of their league. I shall return to this point after noticing other details which ought to be mentioned in this place. Chapter 27. In the annexation of Holland to France, every measure was adopted which was calculated to render the operation as little unpleasant to the Dutch as circumstances would permit. The emperor enjoined that the most upright and distinguished individuals in the French administration should be sent there as prefects over the provinces. The same course was adopted in respect to every other branch of service. All were displaced except the mayors and some persons belonging to the finance department. The other Dutch functionaries came to occupy in France the places of those Frenchmen who had been sent to fill their situations in Holland. No means were neglected that offered any prospect of completely harmonizing the institutions of the two countries and stifling the very germ of internal dissensions, an object, however, which failed to success because the commercial interests of the Dutch rendered them deaf to every proposal that fell short of restoring their freedom of navigation, which was rapidly declining. Everything was left to the effected time, but this expectation was dispelled by a succession of unfortunate events. The annexation of Holland was looked upon in France with an evil eye, as it was foreseen that it would rekindle the war as an extension of power which baffled even the calculations of men of no ordinary capacity appeared quite preposterous. Many were the censurers of independent and fearless characters whose sound reflections respecting such an augmentation of territory were listened to with attention. The opinion continued to prevail that the emperor would definitively unite to France whatever countries he thought proper, and that the limit of those annexations was dependent upon the period when his enemies might, on their own part, restore what they had united to their dominions in virtue and titles, as unsound as those to which he might lay claim. While censurers exercised their powers of criticism, courtiers were found lavish in their praise, and it had become the fashion to consult history for the purpose of ascertaining what had been the greatest extent of the Roman Empire, the height of its glory and splendor, as if it were disgraceful on the part of France to stop short until she had acquired an equal extension of territory. The emperor's determination was uninfluenced by the language of either party. His operations had an object in view, which he did not even impart to those who might perhaps have most effectually promoted them, and in the meanwhile they were misrepresented by insignificant courtiers whose artful malevolence was not slow in taking advantage of them. An unaccountable death carried off at this period the Prince of Augustenburg, whom the Diet of Sweden had chosen for hereditary prince of their country, the sovereign of which was far advanced in years and had not any children. This event imposed upon the Swedes the necessity of proceeding to a fresh election, and they indicated the intention of making a choice which would bring them into closer connection with France. Their advances were not rejected. Marshal Bernadotte was known to them by public report. They had been in communication with and kindly treated by him during the war in 1809. They felt inclined to give him the preference over every other. The emperor was not sorry for it. Although Marshal Bernadotte had occasionally excited his displeasure, he still entertained an old friendship for all those who had served in Italy, so that he not only did not oppose the Diet's choice, which was in fact a sort of homage rendered to the French army, out of whose ranks they came to select a king to govern them, but he even approved of it and afforded to Marshal Bernadotte all the means he stood in need of to enable him to make his appearance in Sweden in a manner suitable to the rank he was about to fill. He presented him with 1,000,000 francs out of his own private funds. This was the period at which I first entered upon my new functions, and I could already discover in what was said respecting the annexation of Holland the counterpart of what had been reported with respect to Spain. Whatever may have been the course adopted by my predecessor, it afforded me no clue to the path I ought to follow in order to succeed in those means which appeared to me the best calculated to remove the unfavorable impression on the public mind. I had been wont to believe that the administration now placed in my charge was a power in itself, and I found it a mere phantom of power. I could only illustrate my position by fancying myself placed in a drum, which was beaten upon by everyone, without my being able to distinguish anything beyond the mere sounds. I inquired of all around me what course Mr. Fouché had adopted, and generally received for reply that it was his practice to allow matters to take their course when he could not arrest their progress. I was as much ashamed of the dilemma in which I found myself as vexed at my inability to overcome it. And if I had not been encouraged by some worthy men whom I discovered in my own department and whose value had not been properly appreciated, I should have followed the example of King Louis. I gradually acquired courage, and with it my confidence returned. I was fortunately gifted with a wonderful memory for names and places, which served me on more than one occasion. I clearly saw that Mr. Fouché had deceived me when he destroyed the private papers of his administration, and I resolved to strike out a system for myself. Never in my life had I yet employed police agents. I was not indeed sufficiently acquainted with that class of people amongst whom it was necessary to disperse those agents, to be able to give them a precise direction without subjecting myself to be marked out. My circumscribed acquaintance with the men of the Revolution, with whom my functions compelled me to be in daily contact, impressed me with the necessity of seeking in the past for those means of precaution which might be applied to the future with a good effect. Ever since the days of my boyhood, I had felt a strong aversion to the Duke of Orleans. It grew out of the opinions generally prevailing at the period of my entrance into the service, and had acquired strength by all that I heard ever since our saloons had become the resort of the scattered fragments of all parties. I was engaged for upwards of a month in a private perusal of the voluminous mass of papers belonging to the Duke of Orleans, which were still in the condition in which they were brought to the ministry after their seizure. And although frequently interrupted, I at last accomplished the task. The perusal of those papers removed many erroneous impressions from my mind. I discovered some of a singular character, inasmuch as they were written by men from whom I was in the habit of hearing attacks against the Duke of Orleans, and yet I had proofs under my eyes that they were greatly indebted to him. I even found receipts for money advanced, and in the greater part an acknowledgement expressed in terms which left no doubt of the motive. I selected such of those papers as related to men whom I saw very assiduous in their attendance at the Tuileries, and to others who sought to acquire credit at court. I carried them one day to the Emperor at the Palace of Rambouillet, where, from the comparative absence of company, more opportunities could be found for entering into private conversation with him. Being incapable of practicing any deception, I told him that, overcome by an apprehension of any future self-reproach whilst in his service, and by a desire of clearing up what I had at all times heard respecting the Duke of Orleans, I would neither trust to my own judgment nor to a future opportunity, and had collected from the archives of the House of Orleans, which were deposited in my department, the documents I now brought to him, some of which were calculated to excite his curiosity. The Emperor said to me, on taking them out of my hands, I was confident the archives of that house were deposited at the Ministry of Police, but was told they were not to be found. This serves to prove either that they were not sought for or were considered unimportant. I accompanied him to the place to which he resorted for his walks, under the windows of the palace, close to the large pond, where he read all the papers from beginning to end, an occupation which lasted some time. He then spoke in the following terms: You see how little we should trust to appearances. You had a prejudice against this prince, and if you had found an opportunity of injuring any one of his party, you would have been carried away by the feelings of resentment which had perhaps been instilled into your mind by those very persons who were under obligations to him. You were right, therefore, in making this search. Such ought always to be your rule of conduct. I am well satisfied that the Duke of Orleans was not a bad man. Had he been disgraced by the vices laid to his charge, nothing could have prevented his executing the project he was said to have entertained. He was nothing more than a lever in the hands of the agitators of that period, who involved him in their proceedings in order to find a pretense for extorting money from him. And it now appears that when their first demands were complied with, they no longer kept within bounds. It ought not even to surprise us if those who were his debtors had concerted together the means of securing a discharge of their obligations and brought about his ruin by stirring up the public indignation against him. The fact is that the Duke of Orleans found himself placed in extraordinary circumstances, which it was impossible for him to foresee when he embarked in the revolution, a proof that he acted with the same frankness which animated all France on the occasion. What other course was he to pursue? The exasperation of contending parties at that period had shut him out from foreign countries. I do not approve of what he did, but I pity him. I would not answer for anyone who might have been thrown by chance into a similar situation. The lesson is an awful one, which will be treasured up in the pages of history. I feel no interest in the matter. I readily believe that there has existed a party of the Duke of Orleans during the period of our internal discourse. I even think it might revive were the throne to become vacant, but so long as I live, it is a chimerical idea which will never win over any proselytes. Everyone has now what he hoped for, and even beyond his hopes. Do you not therefore suppose that he would consider himself as secure in his possessions under my sway as under the Duke of Orleans? You may judge how many persons there are whose very existence would be in danger if I were susceptible of fear in consequence of what you have shown me. I should not in fact deem myself secure with anyone, because I should be constantly annoyed by meddlers. And when once measures of severity are resorted to, the wisest know not where to stop. You now have my sentiments on the subject and are no longer to allude to it without serious grounds for doing so. Consign all that trash to the flames, and do not molest any of the parties. Never let them know that I have read those papers, for it would throw them into a painful embarrassment. There are many upon whom I set a great value. They imagined at the time they were adopting a proper course. They were perhaps in the right. I adhere to no other party than the mass of the nation. Endeavor to reconcile all opinions. It is essentially my policy to unite them. I must govern with the assistance of all, without looking back to the actions of each. All have rallied round me in order to enjoy security and repose. If everything were to become problematical again, I should be immediately deserted. Chapter 28. Mr. Fouché had deceived me when he pointed out to my notice certain agents who were the dregs of society and had been excluded from his company with the exception of one or two individuals who consented that he should present them to me. These are the only ones he made me acquainted with. I determined, however, not to be too proud. I conversed with all for the purpose of learning from themselves what was the nature of their employment. Some I found whose outward appearances did not correspond with their merit, and I had reason to applaud my generosity towards them. My first attempt was to recover by stratagem all the threads of the machinery which my predecessor had thrown away with malicious intention. I soon succeeded by natural means, which my own penetration suggested to me. In all extensive branches of administration there is to be found a register of addresses in order that the letter carriers employed ad hoc may know from what point they are to set out in order to shorten their route. The register of the Ministry of Police presented an ample display of that nature. It was kept by the office messengers, and as I felt desirous of disguising my plan, I selected a particular night when I could dismiss the people about me, and I gave a long errand to the messenger whose turn it was to be on duty, allowing him afterwards to retire to rest instead of waiting upon me. He was no sooner gone than I took away the register as well as the bundle of receipts which the police commissioners carefully preserved in the event of any demand being made respecting the non-delivery of letters. I shut myself up in my study for the purpose of making a statement of those addresses, which in some cases pointed out the professions of the parties. I passed the night in taking a copy of the register, and in selecting from the bundle of receipts all those which bore the same date, and that date corresponding with the day on which M. Fouché drew up the list of guests invited to his official dinners, which took place on Wednesdays, and during the winter only. These attracted my curiosity much less than the names of those for whose visits to the Ministry of Police I was at a loss to account. When this work was gone through, I returned the papers to the place from whence I had taken them. I had a long legend of names and addresses, some of them not known to me, although I should as soon have sought for them in China as upon this catalog. The description of several names was only given by a capital letter. I readily treasured them up as being the most valuable, and succeeded in discovering the parties by the stratagem I shall have to relate, and which the embarrassment of my situation rendered the more excusable, as it originated in another motive than mere idle curiosity. I divided my catalogue of addresses into districts or 12 portions, and desired an agent in each district to furnish me a detailed note of the rank of each individual, set down his country, the time he had been in Paris, his means of existence, his occupations and characters. Without alleging any motive for my inquiries, they fully answered my object, for there is no city in Europe where a person can be so easily found as in Paris, if once known there. It required no conjurer to discover the utility of that information, and I felt no apprehension of considering some individuals as being well calculated to serve my views, who had been the very agents of my predecessor. I summoned them to appear by notes written in the third person without fixing any hour for giving them audience, merely taking care to send for them on different days. They were exact to the appointment, and actually fell into their old habits of coming at night. The doorkeeper of my closet, when he announced them, handed me the notes I had written to them, and which had been their means of admission into my hotel. Previously, however, to receiving them, I detained the messenger for a moment, and asked him if such gentleman or lady often came to see the Duke of Otranto, and at what hour they visited him. He was in general well acquainted with everyone. I thus contrived to discover what kind of reception I ought to give the person whose name was announced to me, and who came with the impression that everything had been repeated to me by my predecessor, and otherwise they could not have been found out. I always pretended as if my information was derived from Mr. Fouché himself, and by the promise of perfect secrecy, I soon procured the renewal of the intercourse with my department. The names beginning with capital letters were soon added to the number, with the view to discover the individuals. I had recourse to police agents of long standing, who called at all the houses bearing the numbers set down in the note of particulars respecting those whose names began with the capital letter. Several were found whose names began by the same letter. I had a similar inquiry set on foot respecting each, and when embarrassed by the similarity of names, it occurred to me to write to them again in the third person, putting nothing more than the capital letter, which was the only indication I possessed respecting them. I sent the letters by my office messengers, who were generally known to the porters, owing to their occasional appearance, and as the latter are well acquainted with every movement of those who inhabit the houses under their care, they never failed handing the letter to the person for whom it was intended, though there was no other address upon it than the capital letter. So accustomed were they to take in letters folded and sealed in the same manner. The person to whom it was delivered imagined that all was discovered, and only thought about entering into new arrangements, though quite at a loss to account for being made known to the new minister without previous consent to it. The porter would sometimes deliver to such a person the two letters bearing for address nothing but the same capital letter, a proof that I was correct in my surmise, and that person would produce both on coming to my closet, and remarked that he had no doubt they had been twice written in by mistake. It was easy to keep him under this impression, as each letter appointed a different day for waiting upon me. I thereby succeeded in finding out all the sources of information of which Mr. Fouché had availed himself, and which I had imagined to be much more numerous and more valuable than they actually proved. It occasionally happened that the porter of the house where two inmates of the same name resided had been changed, and that the new porter delivered the letters to the two persons for whom he supposed they were intended. They accordingly both made their appearance, but as the doorkeeper knew the right person, I was at no loss to find in the note produced by the other some pretense to account for his being summoned to appear. I resorted to another means of coming at the track of my predecessor's proceedings. I ordered my cashier to inform me when the regular hangers-on should present themselves to receive money. By regular hangers-on, I mean such only as had ostensible duties to perform. Pride kept them all back the first month, but on reflection they afterwards found that no trade is so bad as that of a proud man. They came under some pretext or another to inquire at the office if the payments would continue. I gave audience to everyone, made no reduction in the emoluments, and considerably increased the salaries of the greater part of those whom I employed, and of those who worked under my immediate orders. I derived some advantage from this kind of novitiate to which I was forced to submit in order to create a system by substituting fresh means to those which ought to have been left by my predecessor at my disposal, but I had not yet succeeded in coming at any valuable source of information. I could not believe that everything was known to me, as I had not wherewith to exhaust one half of the sum assigned by the emperor to this branch of the service, though nearly the whole amount had hitherto been absorbed when the year had come to a close. Another instructive lesson which I derived from this little stratagem was to discover the possibility of coming into contact with society under a variety of forms, which I formerly never should have ventured to hint at to any individual. This enabled me to judge to what degree of esteem men's characters are entitled, what price is to be set upon the pliability of each, a price necessarily depending upon their position, their loose habits of life, and proneness to irregular and improper pursuits. With respect to others, I resorted to indirect means of obtaining the same object. I considered that a man was sufficiently unfortunate when reduced to act in this character, and thought it more to my advantage to raise rather than degrade them in their self-estimation. In the case of a few, this course was attended with success. I received their information and rewarded them with thanks. These few have shown me attention when fortune had forsaken me. The rest have dismissed me from the recollection. Some have even gone so far as to heap calumnies on my character. The information, however limited, which I thus acquired gave me the courage to seek the means of extending it. I soon discovered that I had been frightened at a mere shadow. I had carried my inquiry so far that I could hardly trust to my success. After having thus furnished my oratory with votaries, it became my object to find employment for them. The higher society, as well as the society composed of commercial people and citizens, is divided into coteries. I was not long in making the requisite classification, and did it in so effectual a manner as to be rarely mistaken in the names of those who had attended an assembly, a ball, or what was then termed a bouillotte. Whenever I came to be apprised of the existence of one in any private house, it is not to be inferred from this that great importance was attached to all that was said at such parties. It would have been as difficult to collect on those occasions any matter really useful to my purpose as to count the grains of sand on the seashore. The utmost degree of watchfulness was, however, exerted to discover if those meetings were not taken advantage of to spread evil reports or unfavorable intelligence, such as projects of war or fresh financial schemes. The mischievous hawkers of bad news generally took especial care to disseminate them in those societies which they knew to be composed of persons whose interests were more likely to suffer from the events reported to them. When an opportunity presented itself, the official looker-on would listen to the news-bearer and by engaging to conversation with him, seldom failed to discover where he had picked up the news in which he took so much pains to alarm the peaceful part of the community. This is the manner in which a list was eventually formed of all the reporters of idle stories, and when they exposed themselves to punishment by their conduct, they were called to a very severe account for all their past indiscreet language. There is to be found in Paris a certain class of people who subsist upon the credulousness and good nature of others. They have a decided interest in being apprised of everything, whether true or false. They put down their account current, if I may use this figurative expression, everything they happen to learn. These trifles are the coin in which they pay for their dinner or their admission to the theater. They bring for their stock some piece of news, which they exchange for another. These are truly valuable men for a minister of police. He may make sure of their aid in return for helping them out of some scrape in which they never fail to involve themselves. Their employment is to give publicity to whatever news it is wished to spread abroad, and to find out the source from whence has emanated any news which it is desirable to suppress. The progress of intrigue never slackens, because there are never-ending wants which compel its promoters to have their minds incessantly at work. An intriguer who is inactive soon finds his way to the hospital. An active one, on the contrary, would reap a harvest from an eggshell. An intriguer is thoroughly informed of the tender connections of all his friends, always ready to advise either lover. He sets them by the ears in order to bring about a reconciliation between them. He watches every feeling of animosity and passion. He invites some to partake in his unbridled pleasures, and watches on those occasions the looseness of their morals, for his vigilance is particularly directed to places of improper resort. If in the night time you desire to find out a man of pleasure, he instinctively knows at what rendezvous of gallantry he is to be found. The restaurateur he may have patronized, the theater he has frequented. If a giddy woman is the object of inquiry, the mere description is enough for him to point her out. In no town of the world, however small, can a person be found out more quickly than in Paris. In summertime, when the higher society have retired to their country residences, there are less facilities for discovering what it is wished to find out. But even then, an infallible resource presents itself. Country parties possess attractions in a very great variety. A little familiarity with good company is sufficient to procure, before the close of the season, a correct knowledge of all country parties intended to be given from the end of June until the month of November. It is known that such a company is to assemble at a certain residence in such a month. It proceeds to another residence in the succeeding month, and is replaced by other company. They thus travel the round of a province, and those visitors seldom omit on their return to report all they have seen or heard in their excursions. And if it be particularly desired to obtain information of what has occurred in every one of those country houses, it generally happens that what is thus innocently related will lead you to the track of what it is of much greater importance for you to discover. The greater part of those country residences employ messengers who carry to the nearest post office the letters of the party assembled, and bring others back from it in a like manner. If anything of consequence is going on, there are hundreds of ways of finding out the truth, because real innocence assumes no disguise. And when it comes into contact with guilty persons, it lays their conduct open with perfect candor. Whatever the imagination of some weak or unreasonable minds construed into vexatious proceedings was ascribed by them to an inquisitive system adopted by the emperor, whilst those proceedings were wholly occasioned by the animosity of a few individuals who assumed the mantle of authority, the better to gratify their private revenge. I have known some persons who fancied that the emperor bore them ill will, and I have since ascertained that he neither was not acquainted with their names, or only entertained a favorable opinion of them. It was generally supposed that the emperor felt great interest in breaking through the privacy of domestic affairs, and in being made acquainted with every particular concerning them. I even know that, speaking on this subject, Mr. Fouché has presumed to use the following expressions. You little know the Emperor. He would feel a pleasure in cooking everyone's dinner. He used these words to myself. If there ever was anyone amongst the ministers of police to whom the Emperor would have felt no hesitation in confiding the petty details that might have excited his curiosity, I am assuredly that person. Now, I can safely declare that during the 4 years I held that situation, he never once asked me for particulars concerning the family affairs of anyone, except when it was a question of bestowing an appointment to which a certain consideration was attached, and which claimed, as in the instance of a prefecture, the respect of a portion of society or of a whole country. He then required that the individual's character should be perfectly unblemished. And I have known cases in which the discredit entailed upon a family by the misconduct of one of its members would deprive it of a lucrative situation, which it would otherwise have acquired. It was nevertheless a matter of astonishment that the Emperor should have known a multitude of trifling stories which it was imagined he never could have learned except through the Minister of Police. I thought so too, until I came to hold the place. The Emperor's source of information was as follows. He was not always confined to his closet, but frequently received company. He was fond of society, particularly that of the fair sex, and it must be acknowledged that for the last quarter of a century this sex has adopted a mode of passing time and a kind of occupation so widely different from their pursuits in former days, when, with accomplishments no less brilliant, they took mere pains to cultivate and adorn their minds, that a woman can hardly speak of her new neighbor without bringing in calumny for the principal topic of conversation. The consequence was that jealousy and a spirit of rivalry and the demand for favors gave rise to serious acts of indiscretion and to the propagation of calumnious reports. During the winter there were masked balls at court, the only amusements at which the Emperor could assume a disguise and converse without restraint. I have often been in his suite on those occasions, as well as at the masked balls at the Grand Opera. The society of court balls, though numerous, was very select. All were aware of being in the best company, and yet many gross and unblushing snares related those balls. Can it be supposed that the Emperor felt it necessary to require that the Minister of Police should make him acquainted with such trifles as there occurred? He had instructions of much higher importance to give him, and there were courtiers to be found sufficiently disposed to relate even more than he could have desired to hear, if he had once allowed them to annoy him with such ridiculous stories. I owe it to truth, however, to acknowledge that he has generally called for certain particulars from me relating to private families at 2 periods in the year, at Christmas and on the 15th of August, the day of his festival. He named the families himself and had no other object in view than to be made acquainted with their circumstances in order to afford them relief. I have known of several donations of 100,000 francs which he has made at one time to the same family, and many of a lesser sum. The secret is not mine, and I am not at liberty to divulge it. But those who have tasted of those bounties and shall read these memoirs will be able to declare whether or not my assertion is founded on fact. I have received a score of letters from him, in which he often desired me to report on the pecuniary circumstances of the families of general officers with whose services he had reason to be satisfied. The first letters which he wrote to me related to the individuals banished from the capital and to the state prisoners. I shall hereafter advert to them. It is but doing justice to the female part of the Society of Paris to acknowledge to their praise that an inquiry into their private habits is calculated to raise them in public estimation. I've had many proofs of the calumnies heaped upon them, and with the exception of a small number of women whose hearts pined after celebrity, I do not believe there exists a country presenting so many examples of that elevation of soul which displays itself in a faithful performance of every duty. And I have also perceived that those who claim the right of aspersing their character were the very men whom they treated with the most indifference.